first sound was never clear enough to prove anything. Just a floorboard whispering in the night, the faint sigh of plaster expanding as the house cooled after sunset. But over the years, the noises multiplied. Scratches behind the wallpaper, soft breathing when no one was near, objects moving an inch or two without explanation. Families came and went, each one shaken, each one convinced the house itself was alive. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before the story pulls you in too deep. What I'm about to share with you is one of the darkest, most unsettling secrets buried in American suburbia. A story so strange and grotesque, most people refused to believe it when the details first surfaced. Imagine discovering after nearly 2 decades that the walls of your own home were not empty, that they were hiding something, someone. It began in the early 1970s, in a small town where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors smiled at each other without suspicion. The house on Maple Street looked like any other. White paint peeling a little, ivy crawling up the side, the sound of kids playing baseball drifting down the block in summer. But beneath its ordinary shell was a secret with flesh, bone, and a heartbeat 17 years. That is how long he remained hidden inside those walls. Not a ghost, not a legend, not a figment of paranoid imagination, but a man who lived like a parasite, feeding on the scraps of the families that passed through the home, learning their voices, memorizing their footsteps, and watching them from slits no wider than a coin. He was always there, unseen, but listening. Neighbors would later claim they saw strange figures at night, shadows flitting past upstairs windows long after the lights went out. Children swore they heard laughter from the vents. The parents scolded them, convinced it was just imagination. But children often sense what adults refuse to believe. The house on Maple Street had an unusually high turnover rate. Families rarely stayed longer than a few years, though the reasons were never the same on paper. One family claimed the place was too drafty, impossible to keep warm in winter. Another said the floorboards were unstable, always creaking no matter how carefully they walked. Still another swore the walls were infested with vermin. But behind each excuse, there was an unspoken truth. The families felt watched. People described the sensation of being observed while eating, while sleeping, even while brushing their teeth at night. It was the kind of prickling on the back of your neck that makes you check the mirror twice. Certain a pair of eyes will appear just behind you. Children often complained the loudest, saying they heard someone whispering their names from behind the walls. Yet when the walls were opened, nothing was ever found. The police grew familiar with the address, responding to reports of break-ins that left no sign of forced entry. Once, an officer himself admitted he saw a pale face retreat from a window on the second floor. But when they searched, the house was empty. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. To the neighbors, the house became cursed property. They gossiped that a violent spirit haunted the rooms, or worse, that something unspeakable had happened inside its walls long ago. Few dared visit, and the children in the neighborhood turned it into a dare. Spend a night inside, and you'd either come out screaming or not at all. But here's the truth history hides. The so-called curse was no phantom. It was a man, a living, breathing figure who slipped between crawl spaces, who pressed himself flat behind the plaster when footsteps drew near, who studied every soul that ever lived there. He was there when couples argued in the kitchen, He was there when children cried in the dark. He was there when entire families left, never realizing their lives had been recorded by a silent presence lodged in the skeleton of their home. To imagine 17 years of this existence, feeding, sleeping, waiting should chill anyone who has ever trusted the walls around them. Because walls, as this story proves, are not always empty. What makes the story more unsettling is how invisible he was. Not in a supernatural sense, but through the sheer patience of his existence. He mapped every beam, every crawl space, every hidden pocket of the house until he knew it better than the architects who built it. The walls became a labyrinth only he could navigate. He could move from attic to basement without a sound, slipping past the very people who thought they owned the home. The tenants reported food vanishing from their cupboards, but only in small amounts, just enough that it could be dismissed as forgetfulness. Milk drained a little quicker, bread loaves eaten from the inside out, so the crust appeared intact at first glance. Items shifted mysteriously, not missing, but displaced. A pair of shoes stacked differently, a chair moved slightly closer to the window, a diary left open when the owner was certain it had been closed. It was his strategy. Never take too much, never move too quickly, never leave a trace so obvious it couldn't be explained away. The brilliance of his survival was that he became a ghost without being one. And over time, the families convinced themselves the oddities were tricks of memory. That is how he endured. But not all traces were so easily ignored. Some tenants wrote of hearing breathing in the night, too heavy to be their own. Others described the sound of fingernails dragging faintly against plaster. One mother claimed she woke to see her daughter speaking to the wall, as if responding to someone whispering from inside it. The girl said she had a friend there, someone thin and pale, who listened to her secrets. The psychological toll was worse than any haunting. Husbands accused wives of moving things. Wives accused husbands of drinking too much, of imagining shadows. Children were punished for lying. No one suspected the truth, that their paranoia was justified, that their ally was a man sharing their every moment. And so, tenant after tenant abandoned the house, leaving behind stories that sounded too absurd to be believed. But the man remained. For 17 years he never once left the walls. He lived on scraps, on secrecy, and on silence. A life that no one saw, until one family stayed long enough to finally uncover him. The family who uncovered him had not meant to stay in the house long. They were renters, moving in during a bleak winter when the town's factories were laying off workers. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but desperate times silenced their doubts. The father was stoic, the mother anxious, and their 2 children, the kind of children who whispered at night about things they couldn't explain, were already uneasy. From the first night, something felt wrong. The house exhaled. That was how the mother described it, as if the walls themselves drew in air and sighed it back out. Doors would creak without being touched, and the boards groaned as though an invisible body shifted its weight just beyond sight. The father, a practical man, dismissed it. Old houses settle, he said, but the unease spread like mold. The children complained of scratching sounds that seemed to move across their bedroom walls. Sometimes it was faint, as if far away. Other times it was violent, like fingernails clawing to escape. One night, the daughter woke screaming. She said she'd seen a pale face staring at her from a crack between the wall boards. The father tore the boards apart in anger, convinced she had imagined it. He found nothing but insulation, splinters, and dust, yet deep inside the cavity there was something odd, an indentation on the wood, like the mark of a body pressed against it for too long. The family's suspicions deepened when food began disappearing from their pantry. Unlike previous tenants, they took inventory. They counted every can, every slice of bread, every ounce of milk, and still food vanished. The father accused the children of lying. The mother accused the father of being careless. Tension turned the home into a battlefield. Then came the night when the mother stayed awake in the kitchen, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was stealing from them. Around midnight, she heard it, the slow creak of floorboards overhead. She froze. The sound traveled down the staircase, not in footsteps, but in an unbroken weight shifting steadily toward her. Then it stopped. When she finally dared to breathe, she felt eyes on her, though no one stood in the room. What she didn't know was that he was only inches away, separated by a thin layer of plaster. For the first time in 17 years, his careful silence was breaking. The mother tried to convince herself it was imagination, a trick of exhaustion. But the sound returned the following nights, more deliberate, more daring. The creaks no longer whispered through the floors like shifting wood. They carried rhythm, as though someone paced. Whoever lived inside the walls had grown bolder. The children became terrified of their own rooms. The son refused to sleep in his bed, curling instead on the floor of his parents' room. The daughter whispered of soft breathing behind her headboard, like someone pressed their lips against the plaster just inches from her ear. Each morning she awoke with small piles of dust scattered across her pillow, as though something, or someone, was moving above her. The father grew restless. His temper shortened. Every slammed door or sudden noise ignited his rage. He accused the family of feeding each other's fears until the night he too was confronted with the impossible. It was just past 3 a.m. when he awoke to the smell of cigarette smoke. No one in the family smoked. He followed the smell through the house, every step making the floorboards moan. It led him to the narrow hallway outside the pantry. There, he paused. The smoke was thicker, almost choking. And then, behind the thin plaster wall, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a match being struck. He pressed his ear to the wall. On the other side, someone inhaled. Someone alive. He tore at the plaster with a hammer until his hands bled, but all he revealed was more wood, dust, and shadow. Yet in that moment, he knew. The children had been right. The mother had been right. They were not alone. The house itself began to feel like a trap. The walls groaned in ways they never had before, betraying hidden passageways. Hollow spaces, entire veins of darkness that connected one room to another. The family could never predict when the noises would start, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of dinner, always close, always near. And then one evening, the son swore he saw a hand retreat into the wall, pale and bony, curling back through a narrow crack as though it belonged there. 17 years he had lived like this, listening, learning, waiting. And now, at last, the walls themselves seemed eager to tell his secret. The family could no longer ignore it. They called in carpenters, inspectors, even the local pastor, desperate for answers. Each left unsettled, muttering excuses. No one wanted to linger. It was as if the house itself had grown resentful of strangers. Doors refused to open. Tools went missing. Shadows warped in corners. The pastor left after only 15 minutes, pale and sweating, muttering something about things that hunger in silence. His words did nothing but deepen the family's unease. The mother began keeping a lantern lit through the night, but even the glow of fire couldn't banish the dread. More than once, she awoke to find the flame snuffed out, though no one admitted to touching it. Then came the letters. Small scraps of yellowed paper appeared under door frames and slipped into the children's toys. Each one carried the same cramped handwriting. "I hear you." The words were simple, but they broke the family's last shred of denial. Someone was inside their walls, watching, listening, inserting themselves into their lives in ways that felt both intimate and cruel. The father attempted one final act of defiance. He boarded up the attic, hammered shut crawl spaces, stuffed rags into every crack he could find. He believed brute force could shut out the intruder. But the very next night, while the family sat in silence, they heard a long dragging sound from within the sealed walls. The noise slithered from one side of the house to the other, as though mocking his efforts. The daughter screamed, swearing she saw an eye peering through a knothole in the paneling. The mother clutched her, whispering prayers that faltered as the dragging noise grew louder. In the chaos, the father slammed his fist against the wall. The house answered with a knock, not random, not accidental. 3 sharp taps, deliberate, human. It was no longer a haunting, no longer an unexplained Ned phenomenon. It was a person. But who could endure such an existence, 17 years without being seen, yet never leaving? And why here, in this house, with this family? The questions swirled, but one thing was certain. The walls were not mere walls anymore. They were alive, a body that sheltered its hidden tenant. And he was no longer content to stay unseen. The house had become a prison of whispers and dread, but escape was never as simple as packing bags. The family felt bound to the place, shackled by debt, by history, by fear that leaving would not end what lived in the walls. It would follow. The nights became unbearable. Footsteps circled their bedrooms as though a predator stalked its prey. The dragging sound, once sporadic, became constant. The children swore they felt breath on their skin while they slept, cold and sour, though their parents could not bring themselves to check. To open the walls now would mean acknowledging the truth they had run from for years. The father finally broke. One night, hammer in hand, he tore through the plaster in a frenzy. The family huddled, waiting for something impossible to emerge. And it did. Inside the narrow cavity, crouched and twisted into the very architecture of their home, was a man. His skin was gray, his limbs unnaturally thin, his face a ruined map of scars and sunken eyes. He blinked slowly, as if daylight was foreign to him. In his arms, he cradled the remains of old newspapers, toys, scraps of clothing, fragments of the family's life he had hoarded like trophies. He smiled, cracked lips splitting wider than they should, and whispered, 17 years. The father dropped the hammer. The mother pulled the children close. The intruder did not attack, did not scream. He simply stared, as though they were the trespassers and he, the rightful heir of the house. The family fled that night, abandoning everything. When neighbors investigated days later, the house was silent. No intruder, no sign of forced entry. The walls were intact, as if nothing had been touched. Only the faint smell of decay lingered. No records exist of who the man was or how long he had been there, but in the town, they still whisper. They say the house still stands, and sometimes at night, if you press your ear against the walls, you can hear him breathing. 17 years was only the beginning.